All right, today we are going to have a very comprehensive look at everything we studied essentially from the early Renaissance, higher Renaissance, 16th century, Mannerism. We'll be looking at the Northern Renaissance, Baroque, Flemish Dutch, Renaissance, I should say Flemish and Dutch Baroque, Rococo, Neoclassical, and even Romanticism. It's a comprehensive um, exam that you will all be taking your summative, and it's based off of part of that segment 2 final exam you all will have at the end of the year. So just trying to help prepare you a little bit for that as well. So kind of let's get started, jump right into early Renaissance. The first thing you're going to want to know is where the Renaissance started. Essentially, this is going to be in Florence, with this Wool Merchants Guild having this design competition for the baptistry doors. And these two artists, Brunelleschi and Ghiberti, become the finalists. And it's this competition that sort of sparks the Renaissance, this rebirth of the arts. You'll want to be very familiar with Donatello. Donatello is renowned for that classical idealism, also those naturalistic illusions, or the illusion of naturalistic depth and space and that sort of thing. His influence, particularly as his understanding of depth, is going to be paramount as we look at other artists coming up. You'll want to kind of recognize some of the work that he's going to be most familiar with, whether it's the doors of the baptistry, this is Ghiberti, one of the artists who influenced by Donatello. You're going to want to be familiar with his work, particularly these baptistry doors. We're looking at one of the reasons Donatello was such an inspiration to so many of the other artists around. Again, we'll look at his David here as well. But he had this very, again, naturalistic style that sort of the hallmark of the realism that was going to be captured going forward. Early Renaissance painting in Florence, although the 15th century saw the revival of the classical style, it's that international Gothic style is still a pretty powerful force, and you're going to see some of those influences coming throughout. Gentile da Fabriano, you want to recognize as reflective and making use of that realism that, again, Donatello was sort of the hallmark for, and kind of following in those footsteps. Innovations of the Renaissance are evident in a variety of poses, naturalism, and so you want to think again about those naturalistic realism kind of continuing through here. And again, looking at how sort of Donatello represented that. Masaccio, you're going to recognize as the first great master of Renaissance painting. This is a direct question. It revolutionized painting with the frescoes he created, and we're going to look at a couple of them here. You're really going to be most familiar with the Trinity. I believe there's a question or two about Trinity, as well as the expulsion from paradise. Remembering that most of the work that we see in this period is going to be reflective of that Catholic Church, the religious inspirations, and so forth. Fra Angelico, this early Renaissance art, despite the heavy influence of the Gothic painter, this has that piety that was dominant of that humanism, that understanding that people have this sort of these humanistic qualities. We have those fragile nature, if you will, and these are kind of depicted and seen through the paintings such as the Annunciation here. The signs, the figures within the architectural framework, kind of understanding those are sort of purposely illogical. They're intended to be sort of oversized again. We're going to look at Botticelli. Sandro Botticelli studied under Filippo Lippi, and that's one of the questions you're gonna be most want to be most familiar with. Make note of that. That's gonna be a question that I think that's in part of that segment 2 final exam. It lacks some of the scientific order his works do. We see that use of color, those pastel uses of color. This is the Birth of Venus. Composition. Think about that sort of poetic composition. This is sort of a linear composition. We see that there's sort of 3 different elements. The elements on the left, the elements on the right, and that central figure in the center there. Lines of his work stress the delicate beauty, graceful harmony engendered in the creation in the sea. All kind of encapsulated too as she stands inside that shell. Outside of Florence, you're going to be familiar with Francesca. Use of color, those figural forms, solid figural forms, the symmetry, again, having that very centralized figure is going to be a hallmark of his work. And I think that's specifically one of the questions that they're going to ask you about is that composition. Looking at the single point perspective, that's going to be sort of a hallmark of this period. Perugino, one of the most important contributions to the Sistine Chapel was this depiction of Christ giving these keys to the kingdom of Peter. And again, we're looking at that single point perspective, this sort of, again, linear composition. Still, we sort of see this, though, triangular formation that's common of these Renaissance compositions where we have this sort of long, sort of flat, if you will, linear grouping of people across the front, but both of the sides sort of have these lines that flow back to that very central stationary building in the back that sort of creates the tip of that triangle. So we have like the people forming the base of it, while the tip of it's kind of formed by that building in the back. And so those triangular compositions are going to be one of the questions they're going to ask you about as a typical compositional aspect of the Renaissance period. Mantegna, one of the things you want to remember about Mantegna is he did this painting of Christ that has that really wacky perspective where his hips were a little too wide, and that's kind of, again, this is sort of working through their understanding of creating perspective. Next up, we're going to be looking at, and one more time. Here we go. We're not going to spend a lot of time on architecture. You do want to know about the Florence Cathedral. You're going to know everybody who worked on it. Brunelleschi is credited with developing and codifying the first system of scientific linear perspective. You're definitely going to remember that he had the first scientific linear perspective. Brunelleschi, please write that down because that is going to be at least one, if not two, of the questions worded in different ways on that final exam. Most famous for the work of the Florence Cathedral. Lots of different artists are going to kind of have their hands in on several of these architectural pieces. So just recognize what artists did which ones. Santa Despirito. I actually got to walk in this place. It's very nice. Interior space is characterized by proportion, harmony, clarity, and you can kind of recognize this is before all that crazy Rococo stuff goes on. Everything is very clean, again, sort of emphasizing that linear perspective. The Pazzi Chapel, again, Brunelleschi. Bartolomeo, architect who collaborated with Donatello. Again, we're going to think about how many times we'll ring that Donatello bell. Donatello had his hands in everyone's, it was influential in every artist coming sort of immediately thereafter. Lots of influences we see from sort of that Greek-Roman architectural style, the arches over the dome, or over the windows and so forth. But we're going to see it's the second and third story there, so the individualized stories, and that's going to be a break from the departure, I should say, from that early Renaissance, where we saw those very large interior spaces that were sort of singular, if you will, in story, one enormous story. These are more broken up into spaces, individualized spaces. Next thing we're going to look at is going to be, I think there's going to be a question now. There's not really much on any of this. Whoops. On that exam. Let's get to the next major. I'm going to run out of time. I just know it. Leonardo da Vinci. Yeah, we'll probably look at something he did, right? You've probably heard of him. First great master of the high Renaissance, accomplished scientist and engineer. You want to remember that he studied under Verrocchio, but he left Florence in his late 20s, work under the patronage of the Duke of Milan, where his artistic career really began. The most important pieces of works that you're going to be asked about, of course, Last Supper. You want to remember that he did the Last Supper. He is credited with the Mona Lisa. And of course, we want to recognize that he is very well known for the scientific drawings, and his influence in that understanding of scientific, or his scientific understanding is one of those things that carry over again, much like Donatello. We're going to see his work carry over through Michelangelo and all the other Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Michelangelo Buonarroti. I'm telling you, I'm going to butcher that name all day. Born in a small village outside of Florence, considered himself Florentine. A couple of the pieces you're going to be most familiar with him. You're going to recognize his David. All the artists have a David. We've seen Donatello's David. We're going to see lots of other Davids as well. But you want to recognize his David is a little different than the others. When we think about, his understanding of perspective, we're going to kind of recognize that the head of this David is a little larger than it should be, as are the hands, because it was intended to be a large piece that was going to be high above the viewer. So took into understanding that how that foreshortening would affect the look of the head and the hands and so forth. This is Michelangelo's Moses, part of the tomb of Pope Julius II. We want to recognize, again, those humanistic, realistic forms. Again, true master. Considered himself to be primarily a sculptor, regardless of the fact that artists proclaimed sculpture as a higher art form than painting. He's also known for that Sistine Chapel. That's a pretty famous thing. And the Sistine Chapel sort of begins that first look at how Rococo would kind of take over with these large panels, lots of different stories. And so Michelangelo's maybe sort of credited with that experimentation in these sort of large segmented paintings that might lead to that next artistic movement. After the death of Julius II, he returned to Florence in service of the Medici Pope Leo the 10th. Hope I'm getting my Roman numerals correct. Yeah, who commissioned the artist to sculpt the tombs of his younger brother, Giuliano's nephew Lorenzo. Neither of those was completed. It's neat to walk in his studio to this day. You can see pieces of broken sculpture laying around, and it's just interesting to think about starting a sculpture, getting halfway through an arm on a piece of marble, and that arm coming off and having to start over again. Raphael, you're going to want to know a little bit about Raphael. Madonna of the Meadows is going to be one of the works that they're going to talk a little bit about. Think about the pyramidal figural composition, that chiaroscuro, the figures. Chiaroscuro is going to be one of those artistic innovations that you're going to be asked about probably more than once. And again, that's that dark to light as these figures sort of kind of come out of that dark space behind. Raphael had this great use of color. When we look at this brilliant use of these blues, reds, again, naturalism, the strength, the beauty, and so emphasizing sort of that idealistic in this aspect was going to be sort of a hallmark of Raphael as well. Garagio, I don't think there's much about Garagio other than you're going to want to know compositionally he was known for these big voluminous, if you will, compositions that had this very illusionistic depth going on. Use of light and shadow colors, perspective again that again creates that very unique and powerful sense of depth. Again, naturalism, you're going to see that word being used again and again and again. Dramatic illusionistic ceiling painting, again, dramatic, kind of anticipates that Baroque style that's going to come up very soon. Garagio, looking at Holy Night, again, this makes use of that light and shadow, again, that chiaroscuro, that very sort of dramatic, again, we could highly dramatized, it says here, think about that drama that's created by the light itself. And last but not least, Jupiter and Io. I don't think there's anything other than the commanding use of chiaroscuro. They're going to ask about chiaroscuro often, particularly as it relates to him. High Renaissance architecture, I don't think there's any questions that I remember about High Renaissance architecture, so I'm going to blow through that pretty quick so we can get to the next section that I know there's something from. And hopefully you're furiously making notes and jotting down all the craziness because this goes really fast. 16th century Venetian art. There's going to be several questions that come out of this. A couple of the things you want to recognize when we look at the artists that come out of this style. Giovanni Bellini is going to be one that they definitely ask about. You want to know that he sort of developed or was a paramount leader in this soft coloristic style that would define this Venetian painting throughout the 16th century. So if you look at how there's a sort of a softer approach to the use of color, as a more gentle use of that idea of chiaroscuro, very soft, if you will, serene, calm, again. All of those verses, we just saw that the drama created by the very dramatic light to dark transitions. These are much more subtle. Titian is definitely going to be someone they ask about. You want to know a little bit about him. Striking use of color is one of the things, and those Venetian skies are going to be the things they ask about when it comes to Titian. You want to think about the use, how he depicted clouds and these very pastel-y kind of backgrounds, the skies, blues, greens, in this case yellows, and again, kind of characterized by those Venetian skies. I think that's the primary question asked by Titian. I don't think there's any questions about Madonna and the Peruzzo family. Venus of Urbino, I believe there is a question in the last on that final about this. I don't know if there's one on. I don't think there's one on this Summit of coming up, but you really kind of think about that intimacy that's created. Again, the elongated figure. This is going to be sort of the beginning of this step as we look into mannerism, when we see those overly elongated with the long necks. This is sort of that first step into that. And again, this is Titian kind of pushing into the next art realm that's going to be, or art movement that's going to be coming along. Again, simplistic. It has warmth. Again, that human connection. We kind of feel like we're connected. And don't forget that there's always some little symbolism with the figures going on in the background. Later 16th century art, Tintoretto is definitely going to be on both this coming and your final. A couple of things, he styles kind of defined by a combination of that Titian and Michelangelo. Titian more in regards to his use of color. But when we think about the compositions, this is definitely Michelangelo. Got that sort of angular composition, kind of going from this bottom left up to that top right. Again, really dramatic use of that chiaroscuro. That we got that, the dramatic, powerful, power and color, so characteristic of his work, is consistent in this work. And this is one of the things that almost line for line is going to come out of your test. The drama of his compositions is clearly established. He has intense foreshortening, strong contrast of light and dark, deep, rich colors, and Venetian sky. Now, we don't even see sky going on here. But that is one of the things they're going to ask about when we think about that Venetian sky and those things. We're going to be thinking Titian, Tintoretto, and we're going to be thinking about how they kind of took different approaches for that dramatic Tintoretto, with that dramatic use of the dark and light, again, kind of reflective of that more dramatic use of chiaroscuro. Veronese, this is a Venetian painting, was by Paolo Cagliari, known for his use of color, recognized for his classical architecture and aesthetic. Symmetry is the hallmark of his work. Again, we're going to keep going back to that ubiquitous Venetian sky. Think about that that single point perspective, the use of depth. When we talk about the Venetian sky, again, you're thinking about the pastel-y, light blues, greens, yellows, with all the nice clouds and so forth going on. Heavy use of perspective. And we still have the idea of, it's not really a pyramid or a triangular shape so much, but we have the use of the repeated threes. And so again, kind of reflected maybe the symbolism back to the trilogy, the little hallmark of the 3 points of the triangle. All those were sort of again hallmarks of that Renaissance period. Most famous Venetian architect of the era was Palladio. You're going to need to know that. Recognize that he was kind of a more than just an architect, scholar, author, but a mathematician, I believe, also. So I can't remember what the exact question was, but something really kind of strange about Palladio, and I didn't like the question. I think I tried to take it out, so hopefully you want to deal with that one, because I don't like any of the information that they provided the way it relates to the question on the test. Okay. We're getting there, almost done. Mannerism. A couple of things you want to know about mannerism. You want to think about that lack of balance, lack of proportion, lack of harmony. The compositions were crowded. So many figures you couldn't even get the heads in for the bodies for them all. Twisted, elongated bodies that don't work like they're supposed to. Heads that are too small. Hands that are too long. Yuck mannerism. Parmigianino, good luck saying that one. The Madonna of the long neck. Again, if we look here, this baby's really long. Her neck is really long. Her hands are too long. Her head is too small. All of these are classical characteristics of that mannerism. Bronzino, I don't believe there's any questions about Bronzino. Pretty sure. Venus Cubifying Time, no questions. I don't think about that. So, even though don't think there's anything, I do want you to know about Anguissola, and I'm going to butcher that name too, but just recognizing that there weren't a lot of female artists who painted at the time. one of 6 painter sisters, so it's a whole family of painters. But think about how her work, and we're looking at this mannerism, is characterized. Hers is characterized through these large eyes, the small chin. These are very stylized, and again reflective of that mannerism. Her hands are too small, but a little long and kind of strange looking. And again, the oversized eye, the elongated nose a little bit, and that very small chin are all going to be the sort of the hallmarks of the way her work is reflective of mannerism. Remember in mannerism, they sort of played with that the scale. We see works kind of not having to be full scale. There is going to be a question, I believe, on the final about Giovanni da Bologna Mannerist sculpture. And again, he kind of anticipates that Baroque emotionalism. When we think about the Baroque period, everything again kind of dramatic again, but also one of the things we look at here with the works of art through mannerism, and as it goes into Baroque, the idea that we're going to see these sculptures in the round, that you're going to be able to see these figures from multiple angles, and then from each different angle, there's a different aspect of the story being told that you're going to be able to recognize as literally a different part of the scene, even though it's all in the same sculpture. But that's part of the beauty of sculpture in the round. Northern Renaissance, we're going to blow through this very quickly because there's not a whole lot on the test about this. Goodness gracious, and there's no way we're going to get this done in one class period, is there? Nope, there's nothing there on that. Oh. Bernini, there is going to be questions about Bernini. Baroque sculpture, you need to recognize as dramatic, theatrical, energetic, full of movement, and that's going to be sort of the hallmark. When we talk about Baroque architecture, we're talking about Baroque sculpture. The architecture was inundated with sculpture, had a lot going on. Thinking about how this David is so much different than the Davids that we've seen, the action, the movement in it versus that sort of stagnant Davids that we've seen holding a sword or holding a rock and that sort of thing. When we consider again the sculpture in the round, these are designed to be seen. Bernini's pieces are going to be seen from multiple angles and have different sort of aspects of the story told from different angles. Think about the balanced movement, that multiple perspective again, is when they talk about where you can see those things from multiple angles. The Ecstasy of St. Teresa here, one of the things we want to think about is that the sort of the painting that's created almost in an interaction with the sculpture. When we see these big rays of gold kind of washing down again, it creates that religious drama, which again is a defining aspect of that Baroque art. I don't believe there's anything here that's going to be on. Caravaggio, of course, we're definitely going to be looking at. You're going to have questions specifically. You want to recognize his use of the unidealized common people as models and how much that is a departure from the figural representations of the Renaissance, where everyone was a royalty, if you will. He was kind of a common person painter, if you will. Again, we'll look at the compositions. We talked about this one, making dramatic use of that, kind of showing off with his understanding of perspective, and this painting and this entombment. We're recognizing Caravaggio had these very dark backgrounds, creating these like that. You say that chiaroscuro again, where we've got that bright light, kind of creating that figure, kind of the figures kind of coming out of that dark space in the back. Again, his use of those, when we think dark backgrounds, black backgrounds, if you think about, really dark black backgrounds, that's going to be a Caravaggio. You can almost guarantee it. When we look at Baroque paintings, this is Carracci. We can see the ceilings. Again, when we talked about Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel sort of being a hallmark or a stepping stone into this direction, we can kind of see that reflected where we've got all these broken panels depicting so many different scenes. And it's just one big story after another, like a big picture book. That's going to be one of the hallmarks of that Baroque art at the time, particularly when it comes to architecture. The interior spaces are going to be have lots of paintings going on. The exterior spaces are going to have lots of sculptures adorning the front. Pozzo, Fra Andre Pozzo. When we look at this work of art, we're going to think about that opening up of the space and into the heavens, and how this single point perspective sort of creates, again, builds on what we saw at the end of the Renaissance there, this illusionistic depth, this impression that this depth goes on indefinitely into the heavens, as we could rise up into it. During the Spanish Baroque, you can kind of just recognize human suffering. Think about the portrayal of humanity. The color use here, gone in the Venetian skies with the real soft color. We see almost a textural use of that blue. We can see it's almost kind of rough looking, if you will. The clouds aren't just real poofy and pretty. They are sort of simplified, if you will, making good use again of that chiaroscuro, the dark to light, that understanding of that composition. Again, we sort of see that it's almost like a reflective painting of the Christ on the cross with the way that the arms are outstretched. A couple of things you want to know about Velasquez. Historical painting. He was a historical painter. A historian, if you will, a documentary painter, if you will, but most known for Las Meninas, this painting in which you see him and put himself in the painting. We see the artist being reflected. The primary subject, the king and queen, are only seen in the reflections in the mirrors in the central, but they are centrally located. Again, this is one of those paintings where we think he may have been just kind of showing off at just how good he is at creating composition, how good he is at creating naturalism and realism. Next, and last but not least, now we're getting there. We're almost. Definitely you want to know about Peter Paul Rubens. You want to know that characterized by naturalism, color, dynamicism, and sensuality. When we look at the Rubens works of art, we always talk about Rubenesque women. These voluptuous, large women that we're often seen. We'll see here, like bringing in Marie de Medici in this painting. When we look at the elevation of the cross here, again, that strong use of the chiaroscuro, that triangular composition. If we look here, kind of Christ is at the top of the triangle, and then we see sort of the two sides coming down, forming that bottom. Allegory of the outbreak of war. There is a question or two that may reflect about how the different countries are represented, or the different areas are represented, as well as the different gods are represented in this painting. Dutch Baroque, you're going to definitely want to know about Frans Hals. Again, when we look at Dutch Baroque, when we're thinking about that humanistic, thinking about getting back to the common people, when we look at the paintings of what was going on, we're looking at more common figures. Again, this is that painting from Rembrandt, and of course there is going to be some stuff about Rembrandt, but we talked about this, whether it's really intended to be so dark. Again, he's using that chiaroscuro and that lighting that's coming out, but it's very likely that this is darkened over time because of that sealant or varnish that he put over. Um, there's really not enough questions on the test about Rembrandt. I would like for you to kind of know a little bit about every one of these paintings, just so going forward you'll know. But I don't want to spend too much time on it because I don't think there's a whole lot, unfortunately, on either of those exams. Vermeer, Steen, and Reusch, you're going to want to take just a quick look. Vermeer is the only one they're going to talk about, I believe, on the either exam. This is Woman in Blue reading a letter. Again, we're thinking about kind of capturing a moment in time. The composition is very simple. She's kind of framed, if you will, by the that background, kind of deep in thought, and so she's kind of isolated there. Our attention's focused on her looking and reading that letter, kind of caught in that very human moment. French Baroque painting. I'm trying to think. Influence of Caravaggio's use of chiaroscuro, popular realism in the figures, serenity and calm characterize the tour style. And the influence of Caravaggio is going to be sort of like the influence of Donatello. It's going to be one of those that influence nearly every the artist that comes thereafter. Poussin is one that you're going to want to know just a little bit about, particularly as relates to this work of art. I believe there's a question on that final exam. Specifically, the influence. And you want to know that he used the color of Titian and the figural forms reminiscent of Raphael. And why that is important on a test, I don't know, but that's one of the questions they really felt like you needed to know the answer to. I don't think there's any question there. You need to know that French Baroque was dominated by that classical style evident in Apollo attended by the nymphs. This is a group designed by the artists of the Gardens of Versailles. And again, this is one of those test questions where they're kind of wanting you to find a particular passage. The sculpture of French Baroque is dominated by the classical style. And so that, I believe, is literally a passage from a question. If you'll write that down, you'll get that one correct. If it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. Again, when we think about Baroque, we're thinking about the idea being that they didn't like Baroque meant kind of broken. I think it came from those misshapen coins. There's not a lot on the test about Baroque architecture. Again, when we think about architecture, anytime we talk about architecture, they're going to be looking at the reflections back to the Greek, Roman. We see the columns. You're going to be able always talk about columns. You're going to be able to talk about pediments, that triangle in the middle at the top. You're going to be able to talk about the domes. Why are those reflective of that early Greek and Roman architecture? That's pretty much always going to be the answer to those questions regarding the influences of Greek and Roman. Think pediments, think columns, think arches, think domes. Remember that the Romans brought us that concrete without we could not have any other. Rococo art and architecture managed in France about 1700, spread through Europe. In the 18th century, it was coined by combining Pebble and Rococo. That broke again to negatively refer to the taste fashionable under Louis the I don't know which one that one is. 15th? Let's go 15th. Rococo was a reaction against the Baroque style. So they were like, ooh, yucky Baroque. Let's go Rococo. Think about Rococo replaced those dark colors and those heavy decorations with light pink, blues, and greens. Remember, we're going to see the guy pushing the girl and the swing and all those things. The paintings are going to be very light-hearted. We're going to be thinking about how they're going to not have any real up to now we've seen lots of religious painting with deep in meaning, even the reflective paintings of people deep in thought, or reflective humanism. These are really very pastel-y paintings of sort of leisure, people doing things that aren't really of importance. Purest exponent of the Italian Rococo was Tiepolo's last great Venetian. He was the last great Venetian decorator. This is the apotheosis of the Pisani family. The styles characterized lightness, clarity of color, technical skill. We're seeing the clouds and so forth, but you can really see that this is not the same interpretation that we saw with Renaissance, with even that Baroque before. Rococo is more pastel-y. It's going to be less about that drama that's being created. Again, think about the light color. We see those light pastels, light use of color. Even the clouds here, we don't get the sense that all those deep, dark undulations of the different formations of the cloud. No, we get a much more soft, sort of subtle cloud depiction. Architecture, again, the softness and delicacy characterized Rococo are also evident in the architecture. Rococo architecture is all these little frilly things. Think about if it looks kind of lacy, rhythmic shapes, contours run throughout the work. This also, we're talking now again how sculptures up until this period, and we looked a little bit at the Baroque period previously, that sculptures no longer feel like they have to be in full scale. And then we also see even a bigger push towards naturalism, realism, even on that reduced scale, which just, again, kind of heightens and shows the masterful use or ability and technique to create such realism on such a small scale. Age of Enlightenment, we're going to touch on just briefly. You want to recognize that, let's go back here just real quick. In the 18th century, extraordinary expansion of knowledge rooted in scientific and intellectual development in the 17th century. Natural law, universal order, human reason influenced all of those, and that's what we're going to see reflected. I don't know that there's, I believe there may be one question on that final exam, and it's really just about how the Industrial Revolution impacted the use of materials, and that's kind of, I think, what the main influence here. If we looked if this was reminiscent of what the aqueducts of Rome would have looked like, they would have been made of concrete. The arch would have been made of that concrete. We would have seen stone being used, and now we've got the innovation of steel. And so with that, during this time period, the questions you're going to see, I think, are reflected mostly about the material use of introduction of steel. Natural art in France and Italy. When we talk about natural, we're looking to the expansive space. We're looking at these very open, panoramic paintings. We're used to hearing the word panoramic because every camera nowadays makes a panoramic effect. But this is going to be the hallmark of that age of the Enlightenment, is going to be those big panoramic paintings. Let's see. I think the next big thing that we want to look at, narrative paintings with moral themes continue to be in the popularity in the later half of the 18th century. Thinking about doing the right thing, there were paintings that were going to be reflective of symbolism that kind of showed some of the pitfalls of living the amoral life and things like that. Naturalistic trim was also evident in portraiture. When we look at this self-portrait by Louise Vigée Lebrun, the artist interprets her work to actively engage the viewer. She's looking directly at you, like, come it on, bring it on. In the United States, we want to recognize that, and again, this is what we're talking about, the symbolism in the paintings at the time that kind of showed what's going on in the lives, the people who live these debaucherous lives. This is in the scene where the gentleman's obviously been out all night, and the wife had a party where they played cards and so forth. Gainsborough is going to be one of the artists, Thomas Gainsborough. You're going to want to recognize naturalistic elements. You want to think about light color, the feathery use of the brush strokes, even those the backgrounds and the sort of the landscapes that depict more than just like when we talk about the Venetian sky. They're really emphasize the backgrounds of the landscape, that distance that goes off, that aerial perspective where we see that things that go off the distance become have less contrast. They sort of fade off in this painting here at the bottom. If we look off of the distance there, the distance is created not by using that single point perspective where we saw throughout the Renaissance, but through this area perspective, the idea that the space between us, the air between us and things in the distance has an effect on how we see those, how it affect on the light, on the clarity, and so forth. Historical paintings are going to be also, of course, and documentary paintings are going to be a hallmark of that early American. You also want to think too, what was going on in the United States while all of this was going on. Well, we'll look here. Neoclassicism. When we're talking about new neoclassicism, the new old, new classicism, the old, if you will, and we're going to start thinking about the themes of self-sacrifice, forceful composition, statuesque figural forms. These are the neoclassical signatures. These poses where people are very heroic poses. No one's just laying around doing nothing, or in anything kind of common. We're going to look at that, and we talk about the forceful use of composition. Those people are pushed forward because of that dark space in the back. This is the death of Marat. Remember, this one is that painting where he was killed in this tub as he suffered from an ailment that left him in the tub there. Coronation Napoleon. I don't believe there's any questions on this one, but we want to think about the dramatic composition, the linear composition, how much is going on in this space, and again, how that depth is created not by the use of single point perspective, but also that aerial perspective that provides that softness between us and the things in the distance. Paris Pantheon. Again, whenever we look at the neoclassical architecture, we're going to see that come right into the United States. The modern era, everything has those columns, pediments. We will see use of materials change. Gone will be stone replaced with brick. Gone will be concrete replaced with steel and things like that. Neoclassical sculpture is going to get kind of crazy, particularly when you get to the United States. Again, we're looking at how the materials change there in the buildings. Again, brick instead of concrete. Instead of stone and concrete. Still, we have the reflective dome, or the dome reflective of the Greek and Roman architecture. The columns reflect and pediment reflective of the Greek architecture. In sculpture, we have this hideous sculpture of George Washington. Thankfully, nobody ever had to really look at. When we think about neoclassicism, we're thinking about how all of these different ideals from the early mid-Renaissance, when we're looking at the dramatic use of light, combined with a better understanding of, for instance, that sense of depth and that aerial sense of depth and perspective. And so by combining these, the lighting and combining the compositions, we get this very classical composition, but we get it in a very new way with the use of light and again, that representation of perspective. Nothing there on your test. Ingrays. So just recognize that Ingray's work, I think this is the question, again, a word for word, influenced by exotic, erotic, and we see that influence, the mannerism. If you think about the elongated neck and body, yuck. That's one of the classical we did not need to bring back. And so that pretty much gets us right up to Romanticism. And if we think about what's going on across the world, by now the influences of the Renaissance in Italy have spread globally. So we see Romanticism being sort of a reflection of that Italian Europe Renaissance reaching sort of every corner of the globe. Let's see. Specifically, I want to look at Velázquez and Goya. You're going to want to know, Goya, I think there's a couple questions about Goya. I'm trying to think of specifically. It's one of those. It was a word for word. One of the things we want to look at in this one particular is he paints himself in the subject. It often gets compared to Las Meninas because he paints himself into it. But very different type of composition. Again, we got a composition where everybody's kind of just very, very horizontal. Everyone is just side by side on a straight line, if you will. Whereas Las Meninas was that very very complicated composition. Our figures are much more delicate. If you look at the way that the color's been handled, the detail is remarkable. We do see lots of realism. But the figures are sort of stiff. Nobody's really engaged in sort of that naturalism that we would typically think of. The shootings of May 3rd, 1808. This is one you're going to be more familiar with. There is a question or two about this. Specifically, who painted it? Just recognize that Goya painted this painting. And Saturn devouring his children. This is a disturbing painting that I don't believe there's any questions on, but just recognizing that he is the painter. Garagio. If we look at the naturalistic, humanistic use here, with the vacant eyes, that tight red lips, you can almost feel the expression, feel the emotion, that real the craziness you can almost see emitting off of this woman. When we think of the Raphael Medusa, the drama is really created here. Not only is there a dramatic use of color, we see that bold use of the blues, but even the way that the corpses are laying across this raft and the water has got it tilted, the whole composition is tilted, and you get that feeling and sense of emergency or impending doom. Delacroix, there is going to be a question about Delacroix. You want to know the hallmark. It's going to be allegorical painting of Lady Liberty. Here is his hallmark painting, the one that you're going to be ask questions about. You want to think about that dramatic use of light. Again, the background almost becomes a wash of this sort of cloud and smoke that emphasizes and brings our attention to particularly the flag, but the figure of her carrying it, the darkening of the shadows behind her and the people behind her make use of sort of that chiaroscuro again brought back. And the lion hunting, we looked at this one briefly. I don't think there's any questions on the final about that one. When we think about the United States, we think about Turner, but we looked at the Hudson Valley or the Hudson River School of Artists, who painted those large, beautiful landscapes. That's the thing you want to recognize most about whether we're talking about Cole or any of the other artists from this era. Landscapes. Landscapes are going to be the hallmark of this period in the United States. Romanticism, United States, it's all about the landscape. All right, guys, good luck. Hopefully you'll do well. Hope you took a lot of notes.